Yeah, it's just 1 minute before the hour. So welcome to Talking Talent Live. Thanks for joining us, everybody who's rolling in at the moment. I'm Jay Rusden, Head of Marketing at Video My Job, and we're here live in Melbourne, and we're ready for episode 4 with Stephen Brand today. But before we do that, just a quick warm welcome to our co-host, Keela, co-host and resident employer branding expert. Welcome back. This is the 4th episode now that we're doing today. So I got to know, what do you love most about Talking Talent so far?
I love that we're taking an international lens and that we get to talk to people from the States who sound like me, and then Stephen Brand, who has the most amazing accent ever. So this is going to be a really great episode, and thanks again for having me.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's the last episode, and this time we've really started to pick up on some of the international side of things and get some broader perspective around the globe, as well as, still staying true to our home base in Australia and getting some good perspectives there. So, so maybe that's a good segue to welcoming Stephen to the show. Let's bring on Stephen. If you want to jump on the video and the audio there, all the way from London. Welcome.
Good morning
to Talking Talent. And what we're saying before, Stephen, I think it's been the second biggest in terms of the registrations over the last year or so. So I was thinking that's kind of brand by name, brand by nature. They must be attracting people into the session.
It does apply a level of credibility and understanding that I perhaps don't possess. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Okay, might throw to Keela just to do acknowledgement of country before we kick off.
Yeah, so while we recognize that we've got an international audience right now in Australia, before we start any session, we like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and especially any of those that are on the call today. Thank you for joining. And yeah, awesome. Let's get started.
Thanks, Keela. A couple of call outs from Keela and myself before we get into the questions for you, Stephen. So the first one is, if anybody's missed it, so James Ellis, our friend over in the US, employer branding geek, James Ellis has brought out a new book. It's employer branding for small business. But I think, having a flick through that, it is super practical in terms of any employer branding work at all. So we managed to get a bunch of copies. We're going to give away a few today for some good questions that come up in the chat. So yeah, a couple of extra freebies for folks that are going to participate in the conversation today. So that's the first one. Keela, I'll throw to you for any call outs from your end.
Yeah, look, I wish it were a different situation with the economy. I feel like as the lights are being turned off for a lot of roles, some lights are being turned on. And I've just gotten a role from Mars, located in Germany. Really interesting role, employer reputation expert. We'll pop a link in the newsletter that's going out, I think, tomorrow. But if you do have any questions, you're in Europe and you are interested in this role, definitely message me or Dave Machuka from Video My Job, and we can get you connected. And again, that's at Mars.
Cool. Thanks, Keela. And last one, as always, ask questions for Stephen. Use the chat to drop them in there, and we'll read through those as we go through. Ask them now, ask them anytime, just drop them in the chat. And if you impress our producer, Paul, he's a hard man to please, but he can be impressed with some good questions for the guests. So we might very well give you one of our Video My Job giveaway packs that is full of secret stuff that you definitely want. So make sure to get involved with the conversation today. So for those who don't know you, Stephen, you've been in the employee brand or even recruitment marketing game, for a good 10 years from what I can see, and you've literally just moved over to EY like a few months ago. So do you want to tell us a bit about what enticed you? I think it's back over to EY for a second time, and what does that kind of challenge that you're facing into look like now?
Yeah, sure. So hello again, everyone. Thanks for inviting me on, guys. Back at EY for a second stint, started on 1st of February. I did a maternity leave cover here 2012, I think. So it's been a little while, but you were very kind to say I've been in and around the game for 10 years. It's quite a lot more than that. But that, I guess that cutoff point, 2012, that was my first client side role. So previous to that, I'd been in creative agencies, like a agency, TMP, etc. This was the first step into the client side world, and that was such a transformative experience in terms of my understanding of employer brand and the impact and how to get things done inside an organization, not on the outside looking in. But also the culture at EY and the team we had there at the time was just so so engaging, so welcoming, even for someone like me that was clearly only going to be there for 7 or 8 months. You immediately felt a part of the team. I immediately wanted to go back. We couldn't quite make it happen as that contract wound down, but I kind of, I guess, had my eye on being able to get back there. It took me a little longer than maybe I'd hoped. But when this role came up, you know, I was happy where I was, but there are certain organisations I'd kind of wanted to go back to, and so when EY offered, it was sort of a relatively easy decision to make. In terms of the challenges we're facing into, well, if I discount the last week, they are the typical ones you would expect from large, sort of sprawling organisations. In terms of that, really being crystal clear with a wide audience about who we are and what we stand for. I think we have a lot of things to say, a lot of things to tell people, a lot of programs, a lot of ways to join and progress through the organisation, and sometimes we overcomplicate ourselves to an audience on the outside looking in. So working out how you simplify something as complicated as us is one challenge, alongside the fact that we are an enormous organisation, employing massive amounts of people, but don't have any, I guess, sort of reputation with our audience outside of recruitment. So we're not a high street bank, we're not a big retailer, we're not a social platform. The chances of a lot of our candidates, particularly at the more junior stages, having come across EY in the course of their daily lives through to 18, 21 is fairly minimal. And so our job is how we, again, build that reputation from scratch, and at speed with those audiences where they're, you know, where we're in competition with those businesses they already have a customer relationship with. So all of those still exist, but obviously in the last week it's then gone up a little bit of a notch with news around the firm more broadly. So yeah, there'll be I won't be short of things to do. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. And so you're leading I think it was the UK region part of that program. So I think EY's got to have one of the biggest investments around in terms of employer branding, right? Because I know you've got counterparts in other regions of the world as well. So, you know, a lot of organizations we see they've kind of got that one solo employer branding person that's looking after it. So yeah, you guys have got to be on the larger scale of actual employer brand, right?
It's the biggest team I've ever worked with or led. So yeah, I would say something big when I was here first time. So I think not only are we investing in it heavily now, I think EY was probably one of the earliest adopters in terms of really building out a function to support recruitment marketing and employer brands. So I think there would have been 7 or 8, maybe even when I was there, sort of 10, 12 years ago. Now we're up at 12 in employer brand, as well as those that sort of support and align to some of our activities in engagement with experienced hire candidates, the campaigns team, and student recruitment. So there are sort of overlaps and areas where you've kind of got an extra 0.5 of a head that sits in a different team. But yeah, we're very grateful, you know, that we work with an organisation that resources the team, that gives budget to the team, but then also, you know, expects results. You know, they're not handing out the dollar and letting us go off and do what we want. I think there is an elevated expectation around what we are able to bring to the table, the value we can bring to the organisation. So with that visibility definitely comes additional challenge.
Yep. And we're going to get into a bit more about that in the one of the topics today as well. So, yeah, look, I'll jump into the first topic. So this is really about like the role of employer branding, getting some clarification on that in a couple of different ways. So let's chat about building the story and the messaging strategy that is, okay, so obviously this is about communicating the organization's reputation as an employer, and that's clearly the very heart of what the employer brand leader or team is responsible for. But as like an EB leader yourself in that large organization now, how do you think about communicating the specific role that EB plays in that process of developing that story, but also what aspects of it are perhaps better, not quite the role of employer brand? So in other words, like where should folks kind of consciously lean back or get out of the way? And why is that important?
That's a pretty big question. I guess the first thing, and I'll caveat probably all of my answers with this, is that one of the reasons I like this area of work is it's relatively new, and I don't think there are right answers yet. I think we're all kind of doing it in very different ways, and I like things like this, and like you say, books like James's, where we're all trying to explore the topic and find ways to get where we want. I mean, in my view, I think there's the story of the organization, so the experience that we offer people as a place to work, that's not something that me or my team create. That's something that exists, and we're either good at it or we're not. And in all fairness to 90% of people, we're probably not good at it, and that's fine because they wouldn't enjoy it at EY. So the story is the story. I think there are things that we can do to influence that, and that's about working with sort of senior stakeholders and taking some of our learnings and insights and understandings from our audience back into the organization, which comes back to the point around the value we can really bring to the organization, is bringing some of those insights around how the world sees us and how that can be different from when you've worked inside the organization 20 years. You've got a very different view probably of how somebody on the street looks at you. So I think there's the element where the kind of the story is the story and the experience is the experience. And our job, as much as anything, is to find ways that enable the people that are experiencing that every day to feel comfortable sharing that, to encourage them to share that, to find ways, mechanisms, to have the conversations, to put in place those programs that will enable them to take those stories. So we've got 19,000 people. What I want to get to is a position where as many of those 19,000 people as possible feel confident, comfortable, engaged enough with their work to be prepared to share what their lived experience is of the organization. And then the story and the reputation is really how all of those experiences ladder together, the things that people in reviewing them can see that come through as, similar themes, similar experiences. I think that's where employer brand can really help, is that sort of the mechanism, the herding. We're not the herding, if you like, the trying to make the sort of herding of these 19,000 stories.
It is herding.
Into one direction.
Herding cats.
It feels a lot like that. It feels a lot like that at times. But yeah, so it's just that job. I think, there's not a lot of, at least I've not met a lot of resistance in terms of often in terms of people wanting to and being prepared to tell their story. I think often, though, it's something you're asking them to do in addition to a day job. They're maybe not comfortable always in front of the camera. They maybe don't have a lot of time. There's lots of different legitimate obstacles that will prevent somebody from maybe engaging with you if they think there's only one way to do that. So our job, I think, in our team, is to find as many ways as possible to remove those obstacles. So to make it quick, to make it simple, use technology if we need to, those kind of things, to try and make sure we can reach as many people as possible, remove as many of those obstacles as possible, and then get out of the way. Because the people in the world, our audience, they want to hear from the people that are doing the role. So aside from candidates directly looking to join the employer brand team, they don't want to hear from me at all. They don't want to feel like it comes through me, like it's been edited, like it's marked in any way. What they want is directly from people that work in tax, people that went to this university, people that work in this region or serve this client. That's the kind of connection we're trying to create at scale. So it is about putting those programs and policies and training and education in place to enable that to happen as broadly as we possibly can. That's, to me, the central function of my team.
I think our role as employer branding professionals is actually to be the custodian of that story and just protect it as much as possible and make sure that it's as true as possible.
And sometimes that means sometimes that means going back to the business and saying, do you know what you want to say, that's not what people are feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that can be incredibly valuable as our role, again, is being able to feed that back into the business and say, look, what we're seeing is that what we would like to be and who we aspire to be, we're not quite there. So we need to think about, how we change our messaging ever so slightly to make sure that those expectations are met. But equally, there's an aspiration gap for us. What can we do internally to get to where we want to be? Because we're not quite there yet, and we're able to be in a position to use data and the feedback of people to really pinpoint some of those areas, which, again, in terms of value back to our stakeholders in the business, I think can be massive for them.
I think that's a great point. Actually, Brooke in our last session talked a lot about that aspirational messaging, especially when you're scaling. Eric also asked a great question about where you think employer brand sits. I'd love to actually talk about that's like the biggest dilemma is the term that he used, but I think it's like actually a war of the worlds about where EB should sit. Before we answer that, maybe you could give us a little bit of background about who's on your team, the types of roles, how you've scaled that team from what you said was like 7 or 8 back in the day, and now it's around 12. That's enormous. That's not something that we see that much in Australia. So would love to hear from you.
Yeah, of course. And I can't take responsibility for scaling. I think I was the last bit, I was the last man in, but I can certainly talk about how it's changed a little bit. So I think, where we're structured still similarly to when I was here in 2012 is that we have teams that are focused more heavily on experienced hire activity and teams that are focused more heavily on student activity. So the world, certainly in the UK, the world of campus, the season of campus hiring, the mechanisms by which you engage and hire students is so distinct and standalone that we have a specific recruiting team that does that and runs that process, and therefore we have a mirroring employer brand team. So I've got a manager and 2 associates that support that team around how we activate the brand on campus through student media, through events, partnerships, those kind of things. And then we have a similar mirroring team for experienced hire that supports all of the service lines, as well as getting involved in some of the more cross-service line campaigns. So some of the stuff that maybe is more around DE&I, some of those sort of cross-service line agendas, that team will do. And again, it's structured very similarly. So I've got a manager and then 2 associates that work on those programs and projects. What we then have is we have one individual who's focused specifically on digital. So that means our website, but also the social channels. Now, we don't, LinkedIn is probably our biggest channel, but we don't have a careers only presence there. So that's working closely with our colleagues on sort of content and scheduling and things on LinkedIn. We do then, there are other social channels where we have a more specific careers entity, and that's then down to us. So that's managing the content, scheduling, reporting back on, what works, what doesn't, let's not do that anymore, sort of stuff. So we've got digital there, and then the website and all manner of other things. It should be more than one person, but that's another story. And then probably the most interesting bit, and the 2 people that I think were in sort of most recent before me, we've hired 2 creatives. So we've got 2 designers, art directors now on the team. And I think that serves us a couple of ways. So I think sometimes my experience has been it's really important to work with sort of an agency. I think that external perspective is really important to doing some of your concept work, some of your creative work, some of your idea work. But only having access to an external agency when it comes to sort of more tactical assets and quick turnaround production, you can sometimes miss, particularly on social, you just miss the moment. In terms of getting an asset done, in terms of getting something up and running. And so having an internal team, because we also have internal sign-offs with our brand and marketing colleagues and various other processes. So the quickest we can get an asset to a point where it's being ready to be scored, the more likely it is we can hit that zeitgeist, we can hit that moment. So James and Vanessa are brilliant at helping us to turn around that quick stuff. But it also means that that we can have, we do have really critical eyes when it comes to we're working on sort of campus concepts, we're working on brand concepts across service line. We've got that critical eye from a creative, a design standpoint, as well as those in the team from more of a brand reputation standpoint. So having those skills in the team, I think is really beneficial to us. And it also helps us balance our books, I'll be honest, because we can decide what goes out to agency, what we keep and what we deliver ourselves, which again helps with the budget. And we're a firm of accountants. We're not really, but people still call us that. So they like it when we can balance the books and when we come in on budget. So so that's been, I think that in terms of the change from 10 years ago to now, that I think is where the extra head is and what's particularly interesting.
And I guess the follow-up question is that, do you own the budget? Does it sit within employer brand or talent, or is it something that you have to beg, borrow, and steal from marketing that sits outside of your team?
We have a budget. We have a budget. Now, obviously, it's never quite as much as you would like, but I'm very aware that we get more than a lot. And we could do, and James is really good at this, and he's absolutely right. You don't need a massive budget to do a lot of stuff in employer brand, but I think there's also an appetite in our organization, certainly to do things that have a certain polish to them. They're happy to sort of invest quite heavily in pieces of video content and other things. So having a budget to be able to really drive and fund those activations is really important. But we also, so particularly with student, but equally with experienced hire, there are grey areas where there are certain partnerships or maybe events you're working on where there's brand elements coming in, but there's also an element of direct recruiting and having boots on the ground on campus. And so often there you're talking about how we divide the costs between us. So I think we also have the opportunity to look for ways to pool some of our funds in order to deliver some activities. And that, yeah, that's often a little bit of a tug of war about then who controls more of the output. So when you're putting 50% of the money in each, it's just a bit more of a negotiation so we're happy with the output, and so is student recruitment. So it's just a slightly different, but democratic and usually friendly process.
Who flips the bill? Little Russian roulette.
Yeah, I think the budget ownership is an interesting part of it because in some ways, I suppose speaking more from that marketing side of things, it's like, it reminds me of, say, product marketing, right? Product marketing can sit under product, it can sit under marketing. But it depends where the budget sits, and having those roles, like those design roles and the ability to execute on them, makes a big difference regardless of where you report into. It's like having those actual resources to execute is a big part of it. And I mean, this probably might be controversial, but if you look at how product marketing evolved over time within marketing, it's more recently that's become more the go-to for sort of the leadership. So marketing starts to become more of product marketing because of the strategic nature. So maybe we might see more of that start to evolve in the employer brand space, or employer brand starts to be more of the lead and talent. The acquisition part is an extension of that rather than vice versa.
That's, yeah. I mean, that's sort of the question I have for the end. But yeah, that's kind of where I think it could and should go. If I think logically about what employer brand exists to do and what we believe it has the impact to do, then the idea it serves, and I hope my boss isn't listening, but the idea it serves as a function of talent acquisition seems incredibly limited.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, yeah, I think in time I can see that flipping around. Or changing in some way. Again, it's not always the org chart that really matters, as long as it doesn't stifle your influence, and as long as the expectation is all of your work will focus only on acquisition of candidates, that there is an understanding that your ability to influence is broader than that, then I guess my pride can take sitting under talent acquisition. I'm kind of fine with it. What I worry about is when you say, well, just focus on talent attraction, because that's not where the employer brand begins and ends for candidates, for those that work at the organization. So there you worry it becomes a very disjointed feeling organization, unless you have a team that's empowered to look at it across that whole life cycle, I think.
Yep.
Well, let's talk about that. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, let's talk about that a little bit more. Like, how do you make sure that the armies that you send out of EY to go and talk on campus or recruit here or there to all these different segments are singing from the same song sheet? You can't. We're all screwed. It's over.
You can't ever be sure. I would say that you can't ever be sure. Not least because there's just human nature. There's just some people are, and I don't want to speak out of turn about some of the people that support because they give up their time. So one example would be, we have volunteers that go out on campus. They want to, often more senior members of the organization. They like to go back to the universities they were at and be part of the activity to try and sort of bring new students through into the organization. And that, we rely absolutely on volunteers to go out and man some of these stands and stand up and speak about their career journey. And so it's absolutely vital, really, really important. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're all great natural orators, good storytellers. Sometimes it's not so much a function that the reputation is damaged by what they say. It's sometimes just how they say it. And I think if you're already an organization that is trying to cast off a reputation of being a pretty boring accountancy firm, you have to be kind of conscious about who's standing there up on stage representing you. But equally, I need to balance that with the fact that, look, I want volunteers. I want people that are enthusiastic. I want people that want to do it. I can have Socrates up there on stage. If he doesn't want to be there, it's going to be a terrible speech. So better that you have the enthusiasm. So finding that balance, I think, is kind of really important. I guess the biggest thing in terms of that singing from the same hymn sheet is, again, from an employer brand point of view, that involvement of everybody in it, that communication of everybody to everybody about it, the sense that while a lot of the project management of, say, the production of an EVP, the development of our student concept for Cs and things like that might sit with our team because we've got the time and the expertise, and we've been given the gift of that time by the business to say, you focus on that. Because it involves and impacts everyone in the organization. Again, it's on us to involve as much of the organization as possible in that journey. So that absolutely means in the research, talking to as many of our colleagues as possible, involving them. It means communication about what we're doing and why we're doing it across the entire organization. It means talking to leadership about the stage we're at, getting their sign off at key points, those kind of things, so that you don't get to a point which might be your launch day, or it might be, you're revealing the value prop, or you're sharing the creative for the latest experienced hire concept. Like, oh, wow, where's that come from? What's that about? And then, if without the kind of the working out, nobody really cares what the answer, or nobody really understands the answer. A bit like the maths, the way we were always taught maths is like, it's one thing, you get a mark if you get the answer right, that's fine. But you get most of your marks if I can see you're working out. I want to see how you got there. That's how I understand the answer is the working out. So again, it's on us to over communicate and involve everybody in the working out and make them a part of it. So I tend to talk about the fact that whatever the organization chart says, as far as I'm concerned, everyone works for me. Everyone is a part of the team, because all 19,000 people, every time they're on social, every time they talk to a client, every time they are affecting, influencing how we're perceived as an organization, and people's minds start thinking, do I want to work for this person? Can I imagine a career there? Or that sounded interesting, what they just said. So the more we equip everybody in the organization to be able to know what we're about, and to know what we sort of how we get things done, then the more confident I can be that we're reaching an audience, we're giving them a realistic expectation, but also there's not a lot of mixed messages there, that the chances become greater that there's a degree of consistency.
Yeah,
but it'll only ever be a degree.
Yeah. So one big thing I get from that, Stephen, and you kind of said this for Killer as well, is like, well, the role is not necessarily to create the message or be the one, okay, now I'm going to look after them, I'm going to create the message, what I think it should be and what I want it to be. It's more about finding out what the message is, crystallizing that, and then validating that with as much input from the organization as possible. But then, Keela, you mentioned a really key word there that I like, which is protect it as well. Because if you've gone to that work, find out what it is, validate that, determine and validate that that is true, it's grounded in reality, but also there's some scope for ambition there. But protect that, because like if you don't do that, it can get watered down, or it can become overly ambitious, and it's no longer grounded in reality, and a lot of things can happen without protecting it. So maybe just one last question to wrap up this topic, Stephen, is like, how do you think about doing that without being the brand police? Because nobody wants to be the brand police, and nobody likes dealing with the brand police. So have you got any thoughts on like how you think about that topic?
So again, working, I guess, at the scale that we want to work to, I think for us it comes down to trust. So I think it comes down to we will provide training and toolkits and workshops, and then we will trust. Like you say, we don't want to be the brand police. We don't have the resource to be the brand police. So how people express themselves, certainly through their own social channels and conversations, we couldn't possibly and wouldn't want to control it. It would sound awful if LinkedIn were all just to cut and paste and everybody felt the same, like the Stepford Wives, no good at all. So there's an element of trust, but I guess that also comes back to the point earlier about what we put in place to make it as easy and as simple as possible for people to share their stories. So that might be the technology that we're using, the training that we're providing in order to enable people to undertake the activity that we want them to. So I think it's mostly about trust, but then about training. So I think if you've done those two things, and then you monitor, and you know what, you'll have a quiet conversation every time something goes a bit wrong, because the chances are somebody meant it with good intent and they didn't anticipate this happening. You just have a quiet word. There's no public floggings at EY. It's very comfortable to say, wow, this is what happened and why we think it. So just next time think about that, because what I don't want is for that person to feel like they're not able to do it, anymore for anybody that reads it to then be a bit sort of concerned that, oh God, well, if we're being, if that's possibly what might happen, then I probably just won't bother. And then suddenly 10, 15, 20% of my potential voices and potential stories I'm losing because you're giving people nervousness and anxiety about doing it. And my job is about how I remove that.
Yeah. And it's probably better than people not getting involved at all, right? It's like, you don't want them to be.
Totally.
Yeah. Sorry, Gila.
Totally. The silence.
We could probably do like our own. Oh, sorry, keep interrupting. Keep going.
It's the distance. It's about 12 hours distance, so we're doing quite well.
Oh yeah, that's what it is.
Sorry, I talked over you. Go.
Is it my turn?
Yeah.
I was just going to say we could probably do a separate podcast about all the programs of work on how you educate the tools that you use in order to democratize logos, fonts, colors, messaging. We should definitely get you up on a follow-up podcast to discuss that because everyone wants to know the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, and that's probably the biggest. So the biggest challenge we have, not that our colleagues in BMC brand marketing comms, are wonderful, but there is the ongoing tension that will exist between them rightly saying this is a global brand that faces off to many of the Fortune 500. This is our brand, and we are the yellow, and we are the sober greys, and we are trustworthy, and it means all of these things. And us going, students look at it, fucking boring. They don't want to see it. Why? How can we be saying we're a technology organization, we're about strategy and stuff, and yet it's tones of grey, and it's that sort of and again, we'll work through it. There are ways around it, but is that constant healthy tension, I think, that exists between some of the things you want to be able to do in what the audiences want to see and want to be inspired by, and what, because you're part of a wider ecosystem, and like as you said, you're a custodian of the brand, and you've got a part of it, but you accept that your other brand and marketing colleagues are also custodians and are looking after the brand the best way they think they should. There's always this sort of tension about how far can we stretch it, how far away from it can we go before it snaps, and then everybody gets angry. Yeah,
I think it's that same battle in any organization that you work at, the consumer brand versus employer brand, and it's the same bullshit everywhere, I should say. I think I say that in every podcast, and somebody makes that point, is it's the same bullshit no matter where you go.
Yeah, exactly.
I just do also want to acknowledge there have been 2 questions about measurement and KPIs. We'll definitely get to that in a little while, so sit tight.
Cool. Thanks, Gila. Okay, so look, with the second topic was around activation strategy and empowering advocates. I feel like we've covered some good ground on that already. So maybe I'll just open up the topic and see where it goes at this point, which is, so Stephen, I've seen some of your kind of previous speaking opportunities and things like that. And I've noticed you kind of talk about some of the activation strategy, how would I put it? So yeah, around building a compelling activation strategy in the sense of it's believable and impactful for talent, and it's delivered in the way that they actually, like you were saying before, right? The way that they want to consume it. So can you give us like a rough breakdown of what are the building blocks that you kind of like to work with when it comes around the activation strategy itself? Like I've heard you talk a bit about the balance between internal and external, obviously, but then also this direct versus indirect as well.
So I think, so when it comes to sort of activation, what we're sort of really heavily focused on is how we can get as many of our colleagues involved as we possibly can in a short amount of time as possible. I think when it comes to, the minute, not that it's not true, but the minute we sort of think of recruitment as marketing, I think the natural skepticism we all have when we feel like we're being marketed to, those heckles go up, that sensor comes up, and the level of credibility we give to whatever piece of marketing we're receiving drops a little bit. The challenge that we have is in telling these stories is that it doesn't feel like it's a piece of marketing. It feels like the honest, off-the-cuff sharing of an experience of work, warts and all, in order to, I think my main function is not to, again, going back to the talent strategy, it's not to bring and increase the number of applicants we have to roles here. We already have way too many, and a lot of those get offered a shit experience because they shouldn't have applied because they're not a good fit, but we didn't do a good enough job of telling them that there's not a good fit before we put them in a position where they felt they needed to apply. So our job is actually about giving them a real sort of, as much as possible, a three-dimensional sense of what it would be like to work at the organisation before they hit apply, certainly before they decide on whether to accept an offer or not. Then the job is about how we can mobilise as many of our colleagues as possible to be prepared to either tell their stories to me or a member of my team in order that I can capture them and then share them through the channels we have with the audiences that we have access to, or equip, empower them to go and do that via their own channels, through their own networks, off their own back, and kind of be sort of prepared to do it themselves and individually. So there's this kind of the corporate activation, which I guess is through the channels that we have, but it should be almost entirely reliant on the experiences of the people that we work with to share those stories. Or it's an element of freelance where you can say, look, if you're doing these things, here's this platform. It'll take you 30 seconds. We'd love you to go off and do that. Or there's this video tool we're using. This is how to use it. Bosh, go to town, talk to people, build, that sort of thing. So it's really from an activation point about those two strands, but they come from exactly the same place, which is how we can involve as many people as possible in doing so, and give them that reason to be involved, so it doesn't feel like it's another ask, another thing on top of their 7.5 hours per day. It's a contribution again to the success of the firm, to the health of the firm. It's good for them and their sort of personal reputation as well. So there are many different angles we can take, but that's why it's internal first is so crucial. Yes, so people understand it, but also so people get why it's important for the organization, for recruitment, but also for them, for their teams, for their development, for their growth, for their reputation as an expert. There's all kinds of levers you can pull to demonstrate the benefit that it has. And once you've done that and you can make it simple, then that the job gets easier, though never easy.
Yeah, and then so it's kind of like it's advocacy first, it's internal first, and having those things as the foundations there. At what point? Because I see a lot of like really, like you said, probably more the corporate version, which is it's branded content or branded paid media, whether it be like YouTube advertising or display advertising, and that's like the bulk of what you actually see from the outside. Like, at what point do you think does that come in, or is it kind of last resort? Like, what's your take on that?
I think it's another layer, and it's another tool we have in the box. But if we've got, being able to pay to promote some of our activity is really important, because organically there is a limit, whether it's because of the time it takes to build a really heavily connected audience organically on social, whether it's because of limitations that the channels will put on how much of that audience you can ever reach with any of your activity. They want you to pay, so in the end you kind of have to throw your hands up and admit we're going to have to pay a little bit, whether it's a new audience that you've never before, it's a new service line, a new service area, a new skill type you've not reached or had cause to engage with that audience before, but you need to do it quickly. So I think there's lots of reasons why you would then have a paid layer to your activity, a promotional layer. But really, again, a lot of that is about the same. It's the same content, it's the same story, it's the same messages, whether it's somebody up on stage at an event or it's sort of paid social content, programmatic, whatever it is. It should again focus on the experiences, the expertise of the individuals, getting to a sense that you're getting to know the organization, but also some of the people that work at that organization. So you as whether you're at the event, whether you're sort of scrolling through social, what you get is a sense of who the organization is and the kind of work we do, but also how we do it, the kind of people that work here. I think those two elements help you make decisions about whether, that work sounds interesting, or dull, good, right? That's part one of the filter process. And then secondly, work sounds interesting, but that Blake sounds like I don't want to work for that. Or, wow, yeah, they sound like they really know their stuff. I'd like to work for them. So it's that that sort of double prong that you're looking for. But I think absolutely we use, and a significant part of the budget that we have and that we use will go around paid to make sure that we are a bit more forceful about who we reach and getting some of those messages in front of the right audience. And that's in part because the brand beyond professional services and beyond certain audiences is still not massively well known. We're not a Google, and so we don't have that natural gravitational pull. So we do need to work a bit harder to push ourselves. I think all of our research shows once we can connect with somebody, our ability to persuade them and convert them into taking an action is strong. But it's that initial awareness, that initial consideration phase is where still as a professional services brand, we just don't have the clout. And so we need a few dollars to help us get that clout.
So for the sake of our listeners that don't work for large global brands, can you talk a little bit about your activation experience at perhaps a smaller company?
Yeah. I guess it's dissimilar in that obviously the budgets were a lot smaller, but I think again the aim was very much the same. So prior to EY, I was at a company called Mambu. So we were 700 to 800 people, I think, globally. So it's a kind of a fintech software as a service banking platform. So there I'm a band of, so I had one person out in Romania, but apart from that, it was just me and Alexandra, responsible for the whole of the employer brand and its activation. So there the ask was very similar. My philosophy kind of remains the same in terms of, right, how can I mobilize individuals across the organization? I guess where it was different at Mambu was that ability to talk directly to the CEO, to some of the board level members of the team, to be able to really make the case for investment in the employer brand. So there wasn't an existing employer brand budget. It was, they put a head in, but there wasn't necessarily that clarity around what that would deliver. So in a smaller organization, I found access to those real key decision makers is just a little bit easier. There are fewer layers to have to crash your way through, and you're able to make the case again in their language around the impact you expect your work to have and how that will support the organization. And I think then if I'm in a position, which I was luckily, where Eugene, the CEO, is sending sort of all organization posts on Slack about supporting the work of the team, about joining a webinar we're running, then we kind of, there's the power of almost the power of the individual in some of those organizations is stronger than the power of the organization itself. So Eugene's reputation, some of our leadership's reputations, both internally and externally, was sort of slightly greater than that of the named organization. So if they asked you to do something, or if they validated some of your content, if they were involved in one of your videos, then its reach was exponentially greater than if it had the logo attached to it. And so again, I just found that in that smaller organization, your connection to those decision makers was a little bit more straightforward, but you had to make a really strong business case. And so I know I'm kind of running into maybe where we go next, but it's kind of that bit around being able to talk to leaders about what you're doing. If you're a single head or in a relatively new organization, you've got a really great opportunity to be really ambitious about the impact the employer brand can have if run well, and if it gets their buy-in and their support and their validation. And so again, at Mambu, I was able to start that ball rolling.
That's actually the conversation that I'm having right now with our senior leaders. And I think like the impact that they have by being a role model. So when they're creating their own content, we're talking about C-level suite. When they start doing it, then the people will start doing it. And when they start humanizing themselves, that's when people stop thinking about a brand and they start thinking about the people that they want to work with.
Exactly. So important. And one of the things we were talking to Eugene about particularly was, as a founder, he was kind of very technically focused. His background was quite technical. He probably hadn't intended to find himself running a company of that scope and scale. So he was learning about people leadership, but it was also about saying, look, Eugene, when you go to events now, you're you're a big deal, you're a big name, so we can work with you on, how you begin to build your own reputation across certain social channels and events and things, and be really deliberate about who you are and what you know and the things you're passionate about. So Mambu kind of came out of this wish to democratize access to digital banking, which wasn't in large parts of the country of the world. People just don't have access to financial, to simple bank accounts and stuff like that. And so it all came from that, and this sort of philosophy of his. It's like we can, really build your story. And again, I think for earlier stage organizations, it's very much, yes, the organization has a name, but it's built around the head and the heart of the founders, and where that story came from, and that's really the story you're telling. And again, you have the opportunity sometimes to work more directly with them as they're kind of learning their way, to support them on that journey, help them shape that story, help them really build towards the kind of leader they want to be, which again is valuable to them, but obviously also of massive value to you. So it's a good relationship.
That's awesome. I think there's like a lot of attraction to wanting to work for an enormous brand, but there's something really harmonious and beautiful about working for a smaller brand. The impact that you make is extreme just by doing the smallest thing.
Well, and we always used to say, and again, I don't do a disservice. So a number of colleagues that I work with at Mambu, that come from IBM, I've worked at EY, HSBC. You'd sort of say, look, you can get hiring wrong at some big organisations, and nobody really notices. Yeah. You can hire some absolute duds, case in point, and nobody will really notice for a while, right? When there's hundreds of thousands, but when it's 100, 200, 300. Every single hire is so important, so important. I think that as a message to an employer brand lead, to any recruiters, is so powerful to think every person I hire matters to this business. There's nowhere to, everybody's got to be good. Everybody's got to be important because of the journey we're on. And you're right. I think that's just a massive, it's just I found it really, liberating and kind of empowering and energizing to think that you were having that directive and impact, because it's that sort of smaller stage of an organization where the culture as well as the technical skills are so important to protect. I totally agree.
Jay, what did Brooke call it? That each employee was a multiplier when you work for a
because I was asking Brooke on the last episode, Stephen, around like how to represent the outcomes from all these programs and work and things like that, and what's that end game outcome there. And she was talking about, because Recursion and kind of in that tech, they're more scale up kind of thing as well. And they were saying, every single hire, or they want to maximize how many of those high impact hires or force multipliers, because it's so impactful for them, not just for that role, but then that has that flow on effect too. Then, like you were saying, then they become the kind of people that you can leverage and want to further advocate for the business, and that leads to the next round.
Exactly. And as you sort of go from, the culture of an organization, the feel of an organization at 50 to 250, it's only 200 heads. So in a big organization, you don't notice it. An organization that size, that really changes the dynamic and the feel. So having that sort of in mind again, is really important to think, well, how much is the culture just naturally, it's going to change, it's going to evolve as we scale, versus what are the absolute must-haves, will not sacrifice. And we can't, even though we need salespeople in to drive sales, if they don't demonstrate, we don't get this sense of mission and value from them, we just can't bring them in, because they'll start to, as the organization stretches and it grows, it will start to create cracks and fissures and things, and that's where you can have some real challenges. So having that sort of that dual hat of kind of protector of the brand, but also the culture and the vision of the founder, and having that also in mind as you're thinking about your sort of janitorial, your custodial duties, I think is slightly frightening, but also really, really empowering and exciting.
Yep. Okay, maybe we'll jump into the last topic. Just a couple of questions around this one here. So last topic is just all around that same thing, right? We're just elaborating on this, making the case and communicating those outcomes. So we talked a lot about having, I suppose, even in that startup space, having some more of the business leaders involved, or maybe the large organization mobilizing as many people as we can and getting support for that. So when we're trying to convince our organization to invest in a program, I think, and this is my experience from the enterprise or corporate space as well, more often than not, you're asking for the time and the space and the focus, just as much, if not more, than the tangible like budget and resource and things like that. Because if you get all the latter, it still doesn't mean the program's going to be successful, right? So, I'd love to hear your take, Stephen, on kind of building that strong case for programs or campaigns to get the time and the focus. And how do you think about like the key inputs for success as well as the tangible benefits for the organization in return?
Yeah, so I think the starting point has to be an understanding of what the business strategy and objectives are. So I think without understanding what the business is driving towards, it makes it kind of difficult to work out what it is you should be doing and where you should be focusing that energy and time. But in terms of being able to then demonstrate the value of what it is you're working on, demonstrate the value of the investment, be it in time, resource, cost, whatever, it's difficult to make tangible for those individuals. So I think having access to the business strategy, the business objectives is really important. Now that might then ladder down through people before it gets to employer brand. But I think as long as you're able to say the reason we are doing this is because this is a business objective and this is how this activity will support the delivery of this objective, then I think you're talking in language that audience understands. And I tripped over my own shoes more than once in my earlier in my career by attempting to dazzle with language that I felt would demonstrate my expertise and the difference of the world I was inhabiting. But all you get is a bunch of confused people in a room that might nod along but don't really get what it is. And so you kind of, or I think at least, you need to be able to talk in their language. It needs to be sort of couched in terms that they will understand, and objectives that they themselves are working towards. If the CEO or the CFO has a particular objective, and you can demonstrate that the activity you're planning supports the delivery of that objective, then it makes it a much harder case to refuse. There is an almost irrefutable logic to undertaking that activity, that it almost becomes, you're almost positioning it as a business risk not to do this thing because look at what it supports. And I think then it also helps you be taken more seriously. And I think one of the biggest challenges we probably still have as employer brand leaders is being taken properly seriously by people beyond HR and people, and being seen as a really serious business imperative, as a real driver of success, a real driver of revenue, a real driver of growth, as opposed to something that just fills tricky pipelines, which is where most heads go to. So again, in terms of being able to be taken seriously, I think a business case that is couched in the language of the boardroom is really, really important. It might feel uncomfortable, but I think it's really important in order to make sure that you're more likely to secure the investment, but also be taken more seriously. And that, I think, is particularly true if you're asking for money or more of the time of the board, as we were at Mambu, to help us launch and sort of as you were saying, role model some of this stuff. You need to be able to show what's in it for them, and what's in it for the business to do so.
How do you track success? I mean, there's been a number of questions in the chat about KPIs and measurement. It's not easy in our fields. I'd love to hear how you measure success.
No, it's really, really not easy. So I think, the first way to manage success is to manage expectations, I think. So until somebody proves to me differently, my view around sort of the impact of employer brand work is that it's fantastic in that we get to be involved in a huge number of different improvement metrics, and we can claim legitimately that we have supported the improvement of everything from growing engagement on social, growing a bigger, more diverse audience on social, driving more traffic through the website, more diverse applications, reaching skills we haven't reached before, all the way through to, the really interesting ones for employer brand, where we can demonstrate, well, more people are getting promoted more quickly, tenures going up, we're having fewer people leave after 6 months or 12 months, all of those kind of indicators that you got recruitment wrong. And therefore you can start to say, well, the reason we got it wrong was because people didn't know enough. Now we're telling them more, they're more equipped. So the right people are applying, they're ready to go. So of course they're more productive pretty soon on, because we've given them the tools and the understanding in order to be able to do that. And of course, they're not leaving so quickly because they know what it's like to work here, the good, the bad, the ugly. They know it all. They feel like part of the team before they join here. The challenge then obviously is we can take a certain amount of credit and say our work has impacted that. But it's very rare we can go, and only we did that.
This is one blog that they read, and that's why they stayed for 10 years.
Exactly. And I can just prove that, that nothing else, not anybody they met, not any work they did, there's all of these other kind of influences as well. So I think, so the expectation management bit, I guess, is around the look. I would sort of happily say that I expect my work to improve these measures, and those might be hard recruiting measures, they might be the softer sort of more engagement and sentiment measures, but I expect our work to improve all of them. But what I can't tell you is that it will only be us doing it. There are factors that are beyond our control that will. So I mean, again, a simple one at EY is there's the careers website is sort of built on a particular platform, and it's one that we use globally, and it's one that we use for the client as well as the careers site. So there's functionality in there that frankly is an absolute nightmare, is a horror show, doesn't really position you very effectively necessarily as a technology driven employer, but you're part of this wider ecosystem. Again, you have to play the game. So you're just then thinking about, right, we would expect it to drive traffic to the site, but what I can't tell you is that I'll improve things like dwell time and conversions, because frankly, there are things that we can't control in that environment, and it's horrible. And so we'll lose people. So it's kind of, I guess, managing expectations and then being clear about the metrics you can kind of control, the things you can influence, and raising as risks. Again, it's a, if it's a proper business case, then raising the risks and saying, these are the things that we expect to deliver. These are the things that we can control. These are the business risks that we identify, which again, I think gets that sort of, well, okay, you've thought about this. This is a bit of a serious business play sort of response. You say, these are the business risks we identify to the delivery of this program or of this activity or the achievement of these results. And then maybe they say, thanks, good to know. Or maybe they go, oh, so we should maybe explore at some point. You go, yeah, maybe we should at some point. So yeah, those kind of, probably those two big things, I think, manage the expectations. But don't be, I never have a problem with being ambitious in terms of making sure that again, our stakeholders understand the range of impacts that our work can have, from getting more likes and clicks and comments, all the way through to making more money because better people are staying longer. I think we should absolutely stick our hand up and say we can contribute to making that happen.
Stephen, I think we could have listened to you for another hour, but it's our bedtime.
I was just going to make one final comment on the business case thing before we move on to the final thing and wrap it up. Stephen, so I think that, again, choice of words and framing expectations is important. And I think sometimes it's like, it can be a bit of a put off to think of it as a business case. We're talking about people here, we're talking about community, other things, but the business case piece is useful because that kind of framing also brings a longer term mindset into it. You're not going to say, oh, here's the business case, 3 months, you're going to get something worth your money back. It's like, it's the horizon that you're talking about of retention and productivity and revenue impact is, we're talking year on year horizons, right? Not quarter on quarter. So I think that's where leaning into that business case way of thinking, rather than, oh no, it's just a this, it's just that, it's not a business thing, it's about people, can be really useful.
Yeah, and you can still frame that business case as a story. It doesn't have to be written on PowerPoint. It doesn't have to be just in corporate slides. You can sort of give it some personality. I think what needs to be in there is data, is clarity around objectives, is clarity around how what you do ladders up to what the business wants to achieve. So as long as those are in there, you can still have a little bit of, I don't want to think it has to be a sort of corporate grey document. It can have a little bit of personality to it, but it shouldn't be at the expense of the data points and the real rigor and clarity that your stakeholders will be looking for.
Great. Okay, cool. That brings us to the end of the topics. That was awesome. Thank you, Stephen. We've got a couple more things to do before we wrap up. So Do you want to do this one, Keela, the final question?
All right. So we always ask our previous host to ask the next guest a question. So here's Brooke for you, and then we'd love to hear yours.
So I am somebody who thinks, again, very futuristically, and I want to know what the next guest thinks will be the new channel, the new activation strategy in 20 years.
20.
Fast forward 20 years. What does that look like?
I'll tell you what, Brooke. I just saw a TikTok last night where a woman was sitting back at the salon and a robot was putting lashes on her. I feel like anything is possible. Once I've seen that, literally anything is possible. So 20 years. Okay.
Even 10 years if we're forced to think more short term.
Wow. Okay. Well, let me start by saying I don't think LinkedIn's going anywhere, but so I think, I don't know, I guess, because I think a lot of the channels that we use now, we probably weren't using the same way, weren't around 10 years ago. Things are only getting quicker. Obviously, I can't move without hearing about generative AI and various other things, and I couldn't pretend to know where that's going to take the world. What I will say, and where I think some conversations around the AI and other things are going, is that it's still about being able to build trust with people. I think that when you're making a decision around starting your career, changing your career, there is still an element of trust there. So I think the channels, the activations, how you convince people in 10 years to get off their hover bikes and come and work in your office, that will be about the channel that is the most effective, most effectively allows you to build trust and for people to feel like they know you and trust you, and that you have their interests at heart, and that what they're hearing is true. And I don't know quite where that will be. I think obviously social's had a big trust issue, continues to have a big trust issue. So it might not be social. It could be something completely different. It could, we deal with some of the sort of regional communities even in the UK, and they're still like, I trust I need to talk to somebody. I trust word of mouth. That for me will always cut through as my clear number one channel. The power of referrals is still massive. So it might well be that all of these other whiz bang channels move on, but the biggest chunk and the most important chunk remains person to person referrals, because it comes from a place of trust and understanding. And so we can continue to make that referral process easier, but fundamentally it's about referrals is the channel. So from one employee bringing in the next employee, because that just works. It's what people trust. It's what people buy into. So yeah, I don't know, but maybe it's, the whole world is different, but referrals are still up at 30-40% of your hires, because they should be. So yes, so this goes back to something we touched on earlier. So does the next guest think, as I'm starting to think, that that the employer brand, the owner of the employer brand within an organization, should sit at the board level, should sit alongside the CMO, should sit alongside the chief people officer? Should they sit? Is the influence important enough, big enough, that it should have a seat at that table, or do they think there's an actual home elsewhere in the organization? But yeah, I start to think, as I just start to rattle through in my head all the things that we can influence around a business's direction and performance, I think we should be more important than I am. And obviously I think I should be more important than I am, but I'd be interested if anybody else shares that opinion as well.
Yeah. Would you mind if we paraphrased, how important should Stephen be in the future?
Yeah, exactly. How important is he currently not as important as he should be? Something like that.
Yeah, nice. Okay, awesome. So that brings us to the end of the program.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This was a lot of fun. Really enjoyed it. Really good to be a part of it. I've listened to some of the other episodes. Again, all of these conversations, the more we're talking about this stuff, I think the more interesting it gets, all these ideas. So thank you very much for having me on. Really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, Killer, again for co-hosting. And yeah, if you'd like to stay up to date on any of the live sessions or the recordings, make sure to jump on LinkedIn, follow Video My Job. and that'll give you a little notification to subscribe to the Talking Talent newsletter where we put all this stuff in once a month. So that's it. Catch you all soon. Thanks again.